Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our virtual town hall where we're speaking on Assembly Bill 2748, the Policy Reform Advancing Digital Equity Bill. I would like to thank you for joining us this morning. We would also like to pass it along right now to a wonderful video from our wonderful author, Assemblymember Holden.
Welcome to the AB 2748 Policy and Reform Advancing Digital Equity Virtual Town Hall. My name is Chris Holden, and I represent the 41st Assembly District, now from Lacanada Flint Ridge in the west all the way to parts of Rancho Cucamonga in the east, albeit virtually. Today you'll be hearing from industry experts and people that are passionate about bridging the digital divide. I am authoring Assembly Bill 2748 to reform this archaic policy, make equal access to broadband and anti-discrimination the official policy of the state of California, and to add more rigor and transparency to the process that grant ISPs franchises to provide service to most Californians. In 2006, California passed the Digital Infrastructure and Video Competition Act, also known as DIFCA, to address inequitable access to broadband services across the state and to generate increased competition in the broadband market to ensure better service and lower prices for California families. However, nearly 2 decades later, thousands of California households still lack access to video or broadband service. 19% of people in Los Angeles County are unconnected or underconnected, nearly 2 million people. Statewide, 15% of Californians are unconnected or underconnected. Nearly 9 in 10 California households have 2 or fewer choices of internet service providers, evidence of a concentrated and non-competitive market. We need to be intentional about connecting the dots, from rural to urban, from parents working with their children from home to accessing telehealth and other necessary services virtually. Thank you to CAD, NextGen California, California Community Foundation, and Common Sense Media. Together, we are one step closer to addressing barriers that hinder Californians' ability to access fast, reliable, and affordable internet.
Well, thank you very much, Assemblymember. It has been quite a journey having to be in this process as we're halfway through with getting the bill through the legislative process. And so what some of you may wonder is, what is digital equity? If we can go ahead and go to that slide, we can have a further discussion on it. So digital equity is the condition in which all individuals and communities have the information technology capacity needed for full participation in our society, democracy, and economy. Not sure about how you're feeling right now, but with where you're living or where you're staying, the storms could affect your internet connection, your Wi-Fi, and all of that. And so digital equity is very much necessary today for our civic and cultural participation. It's essential for our employment, for our lifelong learning, as well as access to any services. What you may know is that it's also connected to fast, reliable, affordable broadband service. And so with that, what is broadband? Many of us may hear what broadband is or hear the words often. If you look at it, broadband is the physical infrastructure of the internet. It has layers like other utilities where infrastructure is required to deliver service to households, more importantly, to our businesses. The Nations Commission defines the minimum speed as 25 out of 3 Mbps for internet access, that alone to qualify as broadband. So why is digital equity important? Well, as you can see, whether we're streaming online for school or your kids are working with Zoom back in the pandemic, or we're making an appointment these days for personal care services, for doctor visits, going to the bank, Every area of our life now almost has an online streaming option. Some places even make it mandatory. And so what we've learned is that having a fast internet connection without bandwidth or data limitations is not only essential, but it's a must-have civil right. It's now not only seen as a luxury, but something that's needed in order to get from one part of our lives to another part of our lives. Unfortunately, in this day and age, not all Californians are able to access fast, affordable, and reliable internet. Those key points, because it's one thing to have internet, it's one thing to possibly have it be affordable, but the real question is it reliable? A lot of the pockets for that is, like I said, affordability. If you take a look at this graphic, vast majority of Californians without broadband, that the main reason is it's affordable. But a lot of that also stems from what is available in their area. Some plans that are available don't offer it to be reliable. And so if we go into our next slide, some of the key issues is the non-competitive market. So 87% of California's households only have access to 2 or fewer choices. Depending on where you live, sometimes you may be able to have the option to go with, providers such as AT&T or Comcast, Charter or Frontier. Other times you'll even have those options, but when they actually check your residence and see where you live, it almost seems it's not even an option to open up. And so the lack of competition and independent, locally responsive options can drive the markets and the prices to be very high. So what is the result? We see as a legislature that there are unequal internet access across California. So if you take a look at this map, you'll see here in the Bay Area and Los Angeles, there are 74 to 81% of these households have broadband subscriptions. But if you really look at it closely, it has its pocket burst out. And that is why we're here today. We're here to dig deeper into this issue, but also provide solutions that work. And so I'd like to introduce our next speaker. It is Arnie Sowell Jr. He's the Executive Director for NextGen California.
Good morning, everyone. My name again is Arnie Sowell, and I'm the Executive Director of NextGen Policy. And NextGen is a nonprofit that's based here in Sacramento, and we work on a variety of equity and justice-related issues, everything from criminal justice reform to affordable housing to climate change to immigrant rights. But over the last several years, we've been intimately engaged in the issues of digital equity, digital inclusion, and digital literacy. And we're a main sort of cog in the wheel last year as a part of a coalition that helped us secure the $6 billion in broadband funding to help close the digital divide from a physical infrastructure side, and have been an early sort of sponsor and participant in a new alliance, the California Alliance for Digital Equity, which is a coalition that is continuing to do this work in the digital equity and the digital sort of literacy space. And we are a very strong supporter of AB 2748. I'm here today because not because I'm one of the main experts as it relates to DIFCA or closing the digital divide or broadband, et cetera. I'm here because I have a little bit of history. And the history that I have is that I was one of the main staffers in Speaker Nunez's office. I was his policy director in 2006 when a group of telecom companies came to the speaker and asked us to carry the DIFCA bill. And so I think I have a unique, and I'm uniquely sort of positioned to comment on its origins, to comment on its original intent, as well as some of its shortcomings. And so if we could go to the next slide, please, that'd be great. So first, let me just tell you just a little bit about DIFCA. That acronym stands for the Digital Infrastructure and Video Competition Act. And as I mentioned, it was passed. The law was passed in 2006. And when it was passed, its original intent was to increase competition, and through the increasing of competition, would allow for the lowering of prices, as well as more access for folks throughout California to internet services. And the law had its main sort of underpinnings in the fact that what it would do is it would establish the Public Utilities Commission, as opposed to local governments, as the single franchising authority for internet services. If we could go to the next slide, please. And so what that did, and what that was supposed to do, was to allow for more competition, as I mentioned, to reduce prices, and allow for a much sort of broader network of access throughout California for all Californians to have access to high quality internet services. But here's, I think, unfortunately, where it is that we find ourselves, and the reasons for the need for AB 2748. And that is that, unfortunately, DFCA has had some shortcomings. I think, yeah, that's fine for us to go here and to be here. And the shortcomings, I think, that have surfaced are, as was mentioned a little bit earlier, is that there are thousands of California households in rural areas, in urban areas, and suburban areas that do not have access to high quality broadband services. It was one of the reasons why last year, as was mentioned previously, that we fought so hard to get $6 billion in the budget last year to try and build out the broadband infrastructure here in the state. A couple of other shortcomings are, one, it also has, I think, has failed to live up to the competition aspect that it was brought to, that was supposed to solve. And therefore, I think many of you have probably experienced sort of the high prices as it relates to broadband access and accessing the internet. And then I think the last thing that I would say is that it has had, and one of the reasons why we as an equity organization are so supportive of AB 2748, it has had a profound effect as it relates to low-income communities. It has not allowed low-income communities the equal access that they deserve to high-quality broadband, internet, and internet services. And as a result, there are thousands of low-income communities around the state and low-income individuals around the state that do not have access to high-quality internet services. We are, as I mentioned, a very strong supporter of AB 2748, are deeply appreciative of what Mr. Holden is doing to try to move this bill forward in terms of trying to reform DFCA. And with that, I'd like to pass it to my colleague, Amina Fazlullah, who will talk a little bit more about what it's going to take in order to try to move AB 2748, and what are some of the underpinnings of AB 2748 in its efforts to try to reform DFCA.
Great, thank you. So I'm Amina Fazlullah, and I'm with Common Sense. We are deeply engaged on making sure every kid and family has access to the technology that they need to thrive. And we, alongside NextGen, we're really active partners in ensuring the $6 billion in support for broadband access. So what is DEFCA? Well, it's in the name, the Digital Equity in Video Franchising Act. And if there's digital equity in video franchising, there'll be digital equity in making sure that there are broadband networks to every community. When you have that, then you've got equity in access to healthcare, to education, to jobs, and to job training, as well as government services. So it's really important that we update DIVCA, which hasn't been updated since 2006. And now that we see the world today, the internet's very different now than it was back then. It makes sense that there should be some updates and evolution to the policies over time. And there's, this isn't the first time that we've actually attempted to update because there's quite a bit of opposition from internet service providers who I think are just fine with the status quo, which is essentially there isn't a ton of robust oversight in making sure that they're building networks to everyone fairly. And so this DevCA is attempting to make sure that we push back and actually add new rules and changes to making sure that there is equal access, that we fill the gaps and solve the problems that Arnie just mentioned. What DevCA does is to modernize the renewal process for cable franchising, which will strengthen equal access and oversight. This gives some breathing room to the CPUC to make sure that they can actually make sure that the network providers are doing what they say they're going to do, that if they aren't actually building out fairly, that there is a consequence to that. And it also establishes anti-discrimination provisions in an effort to increase equitable broadband access, quality, and pricing. Incentivizing and supporting competition helps lower prices for everyone, as well as making sure we're building networks out fairly and equitably throughout a community. So the reforms here ensure that, and if I go back to just give you a little bit more detail, sorry, to make sure that cable companies actually receive approval from the CPUC to operate in California, to make sure that the CPUC has more authority over reviewing applications. This is something that's really important to update and correct. And putting checks on providers, right? So that they're not just cherry picking and choosing the most wealthy communities to serve. And then, of course, ensuring that all California consumers have equal access to service. So the next steps. So first, we need to capitalize on our success in the City Assembly and move on to the Senate. And if you are passionate about making these changes for California, there is an opportunity to make a difference. Like I said before, the internet service providers are going to be pushing back really hard. They're really powerful. So it'll take everybody engaged to make sure that we can see these reforms come to fruition. So you can write letters of support, you can call your legislator to express your support, and you can push the issue through interacting on social media. And just a little bit more detail on where it is. It has passed in the Assembly. It is going to the Senate. There will be a lot of process that it has to go through, multiple hearings, multiple votes. In which case we'll need everybody on deck to make sure that this gets all the way to the governor's desk for his signature. So your voice is really important, and we really hope that you reach out to Assemblymember Holden's office for any guidance, but certainly write letters, call legislators, and lift this up on social media.
Thank you, Amina. Hi, everybody. Good morning. My name is Emilio Perez. I am a chief consultant to the Assembly Communications and Conveyance Committee. And my role here in the state legislature is really as a policy advisor on telecommunications policy to my chair, Assemblymember Quirk Silva, and to the greater Democratic Caucus to help them make their bills and ideas implementable. Just a little bit of a personal history about me. I actually worked at the Public Utilities Commission for some years, so I have an intimate understanding about what the state's role has been in regulating cable companies, cable ISPs in particular, through the state franchising process. So in my presentation over the next couple of slides, I just want to get specific about what the state laws are, the federal context, how it's impacting California consumers, and the constituents of Mr. Holden. Really across the state. So with that, I'm just going to go ahead and begin with framing DivCA and cable franchising generally in the context of federal law. And when I say cable franchising, what I mean is a cable franchise is the license for a cable company to operate in the state. And historically, as we all know, cable companies provided video service to people's homes. That's how we got cable television. And over the years, it was realized that you could actually also provide internet to people's homes through the very same wire that connected their video service. So really just coincidentally, the cable companies, the biggest of which in the state are Comcast, Cox Communications, Charter Communications, became the biggest internet service providers in the state over the years. But really the laws that regulated their cable franchising are quite old. It starts with the Cable Communications Policy Act of 1984. So in 1984, the internet wasn't really around, but that's still the basis of state regulation of cable companies. And what the Cable Act did is it gives states the authority to designate franchising authorities, so the entities in the state that can give these licenses to operate. And it provides guidelines for the regulation of video service. So in the state of California, as Arnie mentioned, the California Public Utilities Commission is the sole franchising authority. They're the only entity in the state that is able to give the cable companies the license to operate in the state. Prior to DIVCA, that authority was held by local governments, but in the interest of increasing competition by creating a streamlined process, that process was moved to the Public Utilities Commission. And a little bit more about the Cable Communications Policy Act, which I'll just call the Cable Act. It really exists primarily to protect the interests of the cable companies and their economic interests through a light touch regulatory approach. And it also contains some consumer protection requirements, such as the prohibition on income discrimination. But like DIVCA, the Cable Act is outdated, and it really reflects a belief that a light touch regulatory approach, so as little involvement of government as possible, is going to get us the outcomes we all want and we all share, which is to increase the quality of service, the availability of service, and the reliability. So we can actually go back to the previous slide. I'll let you know when I want to move forward. Thanks. So that was passed in 1984. Most recently, actually, in 2021, I believe, Congress passed the Digital Equity Act, which is one of the most impactful updates to telecommunications policy in decades. And that's where we get the idea of requiring equal access to internet service. Before that, that was never a requirement. And it's applicable to cable internet service providers and any type of ISP. So with that, I would say AB 2748 is building off of the federal context of what we're doing and trying to build off equal access to service. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide, where I'll talk a little bit more about the light touch regulatory approach. So again, as was mentioned, CPUC is the sole franchising authority of the state, and that's really built off the Cable Act. But DIVCA, believe it or not, actually went a step further than what the federal government intended to do with limiting state authority. And it created a regulatory scheme in the state with even a more limited scope of regulatory oversight. And some of the examples of this are, for example, it creates a low bar for what constitutes income discrimination. Actually, based on the amount of customers you have, the companies had to meet different standards. So if your provider was, for example, AT&T, they had to meet a lower standard than if your provider was Comcast. And this really comes from the context in which DIVCA was created, which was there was telephone companies wanting to compete with the cable companies to serve the state. So it created a low bar, which in turn creates very little incentive for the companies to build out, to make a finding that they're actually not discriminating against particular communities. There's nearly an automatic renewals process. So every 10 years, the cable companies are required to renew their franchise or their license to operate in the state. And the current process pretty much gives them an automatic renewal. They have to have their application approved within 45 days. 45 days. And these are companies that serve hundreds of thousands of households, which then leaves the Public Utilities Commission, which is the only government entity with any oversight over these companies, to actually review their obligations, see if they're meeting their obligations to serve the state in a non-discriminatory manner based on income. DIVCA also prohibits the CPUC from exercising the full authority that it would otherwise have under federal law. And the truncated renewal process creates limited opportunities for public engagement prior to DIVCA, when franchising was at the local level, people had more access to their local elected officials. The Public Utilities Commission is based in San Francisco, and it's not really an entity that is known for having a robust public process, which makes it more difficult for stakeholders, consumer advocates to engage in the process, to provide information about their communities and say, hey, these houses at the end of my street, they don't have service, or this trailer home park in the middle of our town doesn't have service. And there's limited opportunity for the CPUC to actually be able to do anything about that. So really, DIVCA created this light touch approach in the hopes that in the end, with as little government regulation as possible, the companies would do the right thing, they would build out. But in turn, that's just not really happened when we look at some of the data that was suggested or cited earlier in terms of there being limited competition in the market. There continues to be households that lack service. Next slide. So in that context, I'll talk a little bit more about sort of DevFA, which is the update to DIVCA. What it does is it's going to create a robust franchise renewal process by requiring the CPUC to actually hold public hearings and have publicly accessible proceedings for the companies to get their renewal. So this process will create new mechanisms for public input and more scrutiny of their applications, particularly for making sure that they're meeting their obligations to provide equal access to service, or meeting their anti-discrimination statutes. There's so many examples in really every assembly district where we have communities of what we call sort of donut holes of service, where you have perhaps it's a low-income housing community or a trailer home park, apartment complex that is otherwise surrounded by households that all have service, but yet these low-income communities don't. And the PUC needs the opportunity to look into that and see if the reason those areas don't have service is because of income discrimination. And the evidence suggests that that's probably the case. But right now, the PUC doesn't have the opportunity to do that because of the tight timelines and the nearly automatic renewal. So this bill also removes the shot clocks that prevents this from happening. And then additionally, as I mentioned, it requires equal access to service and strengthens the anti-income discrimination statutes. Building off the Digital Equity Act that was passed by President Biden by Congress, and then strengthening the existing prohibitions on income discrimination that were originally in the Cable Act. In addition to that, let's turn actually to the next slide. So what are the impacts of these things? So as I mentioned, when we give PUC more authority, which is again limited by the Cable Act at the end of the day, the Cable Act protects the cable companies from needless denials of the renewals or from the PUC putting unreasonable terms on conditions on their state franchise. But it's still, this bill will widen the PUC's regulatory authority and ability for them to actually properly regulate the cable companies. And one of the biggest things they'll be able to do under this bill is probably be able to require build out and upgrade to low income areas where there's evidence that they're discriminating based on income. Right now, again, because the current law really limits what the CPUC can do and the amount of time it has to look into these things, they're prohibited from saying, if you want to serve this community, then you need to build out your service to these areas that don't have service. And especially in urban areas, that could have a big impact on the amount of unserved households we have. It also balances the need for an efficient renewals process. Instead of having the cable companies go to a bunch of different cities, now we'll have a more robust public process before the CPUC with improved regulatory oversight. And then it also increases the opportunities for public engagement so that entities like NextGen Policy, CCF, even cities and counties which previously had more authority in this space will have a formal channel to provide feedback to the CPUC when they're renewing these cable franchises. With that, I'm going to pass it to Shayna, Englin from CCF, to talk a little bit more about the impact of the bill and the local impact.
Thank you, Emilio. I'm Shayna Englin. I'm the director of the Digital Equity Initiative at the California Community Foundation. And we come into this work by kind of universal agreement across all of our grantees and all of the work we do across the county in education, healthcare, immigration, housing, civic engagement. What we found really through the pandemic, but really predating also the pandemic, that work was really consistently hampered by inequitable access to the internet. So as more and more of our lives move online, as job applications, as school and kind of parent access to things like parent portals, to immigration court, all kinds of things move online. If you don't have a fast, reliable, and affordable internet connection, you really are cut off from modern life in increasing ways. And so CCF has engaged in digital equity, again, in partnership with Common Sense and NextGen, among others, at the state level, and then with more than 40 organizations across LA County here at the local level to do this work. And we're grateful to Assemblymember Holden for leading the charge on this critical bill. So where we really see the impact of 2748 here in LA County's communities is, as folks have said, as more households will be able to get access to fast, affordable, and reliable internet, regardless of where they live. And just to put a little bit of meat on those bones, one of the things that we have seen and our community groups have seen again and again and again is that even in the areas where, and in LA County, really, we have either a monopoly or a duopoly in most places. You can generally get Charter. Charter covers most of the county, AT&T covers a little bit of the county, and Frontier covers less of the county, and we'll look at that in a minute. But even in the areas that they say that they provide service, as say our communities have been trying to help people get enrolled in something like the Affordable Connectivity Program, which is the subsidy program that currently exists. You'll have households that say, okay, I'm eligible, I'm going to enroll, and then the service that they have access to isn't fast, isn't reliable, and therefore it doesn't really matter that it's affordable, because even a dollar spent on slow, unreliable internet is a dollar wasted. And you look further into that and you find that that's because on that street, even sometimes, or as Amelia mentioned, like in a given building, the monopoly incumbent provider has not built out the infrastructure or upgraded infrastructure into that place. We found a similar thing, a number of different initiatives across the county where public agencies or organizations have really just said, okay, we're going to pay for internet service. We're going to find the people in our communities who do not have a home broadband subscription. We're going to pay for it for them for some period of time. And so it really should just be a matter of calling the incumbent provider who reports to the PUC and the FCC that they do provide that service, and say, great, like sign them up, send us the bill. And even in that case, we found a whole lot of, again, what Emilio referred to as donut holes, where in the kind of low-income communities, the communities that are of color, the heavily immigrant communities, that you can't pay for that internet at any price because the companies haven't built out the infrastructure to those locations. So AB 2748 will go a long way towards resolving that, or at least providing a process where we can examine it and understand how that happens and how to resolve it. And then secondly, households will have more options when selecting that ISP. So we know, and the kind of industry argument, and there's a lot of data from the last 20 years that bears it out, that more competition does in fact improve service and reduce prices. And so anything that we can do that helps encourage competition in all communities is going to be helpful for everyone, and for all of our prices and our prices to come down and service to go better. Next slide, please. So what does this really look like in LA County? So as a number of folks have said, nearly 2 million people in Los Angeles do not have a home broadband connection. And that's probably understating the case, because we're defining that as 25/3. So that's 25 megabits per second download, 3 megabits per second upload, which almost nobody watching this has service that slow, likely because you wouldn't be able to. That service is not enough to support, say, more than one person connecting with anything on video. It's not enough to support things like multi-user Zooms, things like that. So at that very, very low level, even at that low bar, what you see is that across LA County, the kind of spots in red in that graph on the left, the more red is the lower income. The one in the middle is, again, like the more red is where you don't have where you don't have access to healthcare, where you've had a kind of health impacts. And then the house on the right, or sorry, the one in the middle is by race, and the one on the right is households without internet access. And so you can see again, is there some sort of income? Is there some sort of discrimination going on? It's hard to look at those maps and not come to a conclusion that, yes, it's not accidental that the places that have the least levels of access are also the poorest and the most likely to be non-white. Next slide, please. And so again, kind of looking at when we say there isn't competition in our communities, and we say that that this bill that would address some of these processes at the PUC, kind of in a very concrete way, what you're looking at here is that, again, at this very, very low bar of 25.3 across LA County, you have charter says they cover most of the county, very, very small, with kind of the most up-to-date fiber technology. AT&T still covers a ton of the county, but at DSL, which is, again, like slow and unreliable, and have been pretty slow to upgrade to fiber. And then Frontier, which is the kind of third. And then below that, it just completely drops off. And both Charter and Frontier are providing all of that service under active franchises. So this process will help address this problem at minimum with those. And with that, I'm happy to pass over back to Stephanie, an Assemblymember Holden's office, and would love to engage questions and help folks understand why this policy matters and how they can engage.
Hi there. Thank you so much, Shayna. Thank you to all of our speakers. We have a couple of questions that came in through the chat throughout the event. I will go in order that they came in. The first question is from Mark. Would providing high-speed, high-quality access to all communities require an overhaul of the existing internet infrastructure? And I direct this question to any of the speakers.
I'm happy to start. I don't think it requires an overhaul, but it does require the CPUC to identify where, in partnership with communities and providers, to identify where there are pockets where there are these donut holes that have not either gotten upgraded networks or don't have access to networks that will bring them the essential services that they need today. So it does take, I think, significant upgrades and significant investment, but it's not necessarily like a soup to nuts overhaul.
Thank you. The next question we have is from Sean, and it says, how can we re-engage local jurisdictions and communities' role in understanding and addressing local needs and interests in this space?
I can take that. And I'll talk a little bit about the $6 billion in funding that was approved last year through the state legislature, SB 156, Senate Bill 156. Part of that money, actually a pretty big chunk, $750 million is going to what's called the Loan Loss Reserve Fund. And that fund is intended to help local jurisdictions to build municipal broadband networks. And there's actually a couple of jurisdictions in the state, particularly in the northern part of the state, where there just historically hasn't been interest from the ISPs in building because it's a rural area. There's interest in some of the counties that they've actually already formed a JPA, Joint Powers Authority, and they're going to take advantage of some of this money. The CPUC also runs 2 grant programs for technical assistance, one for tribes, the Tribal Technical Assistance Program, and then also the Local Technical Assistance Program. And the $50 million Local Technical Assistance Program is to give grants to local governments to help build their capacity for developing a municipal broadband network. So through state funding, I would say that the state is supporting local governments and getting more engaged in the space and considering whether a municipal network could help solve their digital divide issues.
And if I could add to that, Sean, love that question. There is a kind of growing network of digital equity advocates in most communities across California. Here in LA County, we have, of course, the Digital Equity Initiative, which we'd invite everyone to engage in. We have statewide with our partners here, the California Alliance for Digital Equity, CADE, which will also help folks identify places to engage. And then locally, there are also regional broadband consortiums that the PUC designates. Here in LA, it's the LA Deal, that is co-convened by the LA Economic Development Corporation and Unite LA. So would encourage folks who are interested, both community groups, but also individual community members, to engage with these efforts to have us all learn more about how does the internet work. Why am I paying what I'm paying for internet? When it's slow, what is the app I can use for, it's called CalSpeed, to like really see what's happening there, and who we can kind of partner with to understand and where the levers are to make decisions about how these investments and these decisions are going to go.
Question we have is from Jessica, and it talks about how does AB 2748 support the co-op member-owned model, the community-owned model for ISPs?
I could take this one too. Shayna, I'll take it. So I would say that that particular model of providing internet, like through a co-op or a local government, is outside the scope of this bill, because this bill is particularly about regulating cable companies, because that's the lever that the state has to make an impact on broadband. The cable companies are the biggest ISPs in the state. There are some prohibitions on the federal level of regulating other broadband providers, but the federal government gives states a pretty clear lane in terms of regulating cable companies. So this bill is trying to make the most of that and make an impact there, because the cable companies are the biggest ISPs in the state. As far as the other co-op models, I think it kind of is related to what the previous question was about, local governments. Aside from this bill, the state has a bunch of other programs that we've been doing the last couple of years, because we realize there's a digital divide, to help enable those sorts of models to come to fruition through the local technical assistance program, through the loan loss reserve program. And actually, in particular, the co-op model, I know that here in Northern California, we have Calaveras County, and some of their members really cite to that the co-op model, which was how we did rural electrification back in the early 19th century, as the new model to serve these areas where there is not as much economic incentive for the big companies to come into, because there's just less money for them to make. And realistically, if they're not going to make money, they're not going to go in to serve those communities. So that's why there needs to be an interest in supporting co-ops and municipal broadband as well. And I think this legislature has really taken a comprehensive approach to helping solve the digital divide, and AB 2748 is one piece of that.
Thank you, Emilio. The following question is from Murray, and it asks about the response anticipated from ISPs to DEFA, and how can we prepare?
I can start. I think there'll probably be some pretty strong pushback. ISPs typically see any strength in oversight, anything that might impact sort of a rubber stamped process for their renewals, as slowing down their business. What they'll likely tell all of us is that costs will go up because they'll have to meet all these onerous requirements. They won't be able to build out as far. We've heard that before. Usually they ask to basically remove all requirements and then just trust them that they're going to build everywhere. But then when you go to check, they actually don't. So I think we've given them a lot of rope, so we should be prepared to sort of push back and say, we've seen sort of the results of not having really strict oversight and not really holding their feet to the fire on build out, on competition, and on discrimination issues. And now it's time for us to actually put some rigor in place and make sure they make good on their promises.
If I just might add to that, and I know that there are others that are intimately involved in sort of the process, Emilio and Shayna as well, in terms of the bill working its way through the legislative process. But let's just suffice it to say that the ISPs are not thrilled with AB 2748 for many of the reasons that Amina just outlined. I would just add that we've had 15, 16 years of evidence and data to support what is embodied in AB 2748, the need for a stronger regulatory environment, the need for equal access, the need to build out, and the need to close the digital divide. All aspects and all facets of the original bill that I worked on that were supposed to come through to fruition. But some 16 years later, we know that that it has not happened, and so it's important for folks to be involved, as we've talked about before. Let Mr. Holden know of your support for AB 2748. As Shayna outlined, there are a number of different sort of community-based organizations and other entities that you can work through to show your support, and the folks that are part of this panel. That are working through CADE and other organizations are conduits for your voice as well to push back on what it is that the ISPs are saying.
Thank you. This next question is from Rolando, is how can we as the public make tangible change in our communities regarding these issues, in addition to reaching out to Mr. Holden's office?
I'm happy to start on that one as well. I think one of the best things that folks can do is to tell their story. Just make sure you talk about, how you're impacted by either the high prices that you're experiencing, or quality of service, or the need of why this is so important, right? That they're essential services, they're essential things that you do every day that require internet service, or because you don't have access to it, makes it that much harder, that much more expensive to be able to engage in healthcare and engage in jobs, engage in education and government services. So being able to actually put some color and tell real stories, I think will be really meaningful to this process.
I would just add again that that there are a lot of conduits to be able to do that right now. Just focused on LA County at the moment, because that's where District 41 mostly is. Between the CCF Digital Equity Initiative and our partners are in the middle of a what do you pay for internet service that is just a very easy, you fill out a form, what service do you have, what do you pay for it, where do you get it from, and then an opportunity again to kind of follow up and to share your story and have that become part of our narrative and get plugged into the work. We have Great Public Schools Now, which I think is on the call with Ray, runs a collective action network of a wide variety of organizations that range from 2-people operations that work within one school to county-wide work on health, for example, that are all also running surveys, listening tours, story collection, train the trainer kinds of things. So there's a really wide array of ways to get engaged, to share your story, to know when there's an opportunity to get in touch with Assemblymember Holden or whoever your assembly member is. And then also at the county and local level, these conversations are all happening. LA County is in the middle of several big initiatives around this, and a number of different cities among the 88 across the county are also considering what they're going to do, whether it's going to be the kind of municipal and co-op models that Emilio mentioned, or kind of thinking about how they contract with these large ISPs to use their purchasing power to help drive some of these changes, and what policy they're going to support at the state level. And beyond all that, if you want to get really, really engaged, there's also quite a bit of technical support to make your voice heard at the CPUC. As I think it was Emilio mentioned, like it's not obvious how to do that, but it is really important, and few enough people do it that when you do speak up, it's really meaningful. And there is a kind of statewide technical assistance opportunity to do just that, including one in a couple of hours here today. So lots of ways for, as a community member, to engage both with your own personal story and also to support work that's happening kind of across your city, probably across the county, and certainly across the state.
Yes, I'd actually like to echo those comments. You know, the genesis of this bill came from someone who reached out to our office who said that they don't have access to internet that's fast, reliable. And it was simply because of where they lived and where the borders were between the city of Pasadena and the unincorporated parts of LA County. And so because they were able to speak with us, we are here today, halfway through the legislative process. And so I highly encourage you to reach out to our office, reach out to your local county or city council, or even your own assembly member if you live outside of the 41st district. But sharing your story actually makes a difference, and it can create solutions that work.
Thank you. I think the next question is more technical, and it's about surcharges for having internet service without television or video service. So I think it's noting on some of the discriminatory practices of ISPs. If any of the speakers wouldn't mind taking that question on.
Yeah, so the question about surcharges is an interesting one, because typically when the state really for all this public purpose programs the state funds through surcharges, those revenues don't come from internet service, and they also don't come from video service. The surcharges are really put on people's voice communication service, so your cell phones, your landline, if folks have those. Internet, some of the companies put surcharges on the bills, but they're actually not regulatory surcharges. They're just extra charges that the companies use to collect fees to support actually some of their lobbying activities before the legislatures across the country, before the Congress, or before federal and state agencies like the Federal Communications Commission or the CPUC. And this is especially true for video. That you'll see these regulatory charges, but typically those monies actually are not going to the government to fund public purpose programs. They're going into the company's pockets to fund their public policy interests, which is to protect their economic and business interests. And there's actually, if you Google this, there's been a lot of reporting, especially on the cable companies, some of the fees they charge, and confusing consumers about where those fees are going.
Thank you. And I think this may be one of the last questions that we ask is, when will AB 2748 go into effect? When will I see changes in my internet service in my community? And what's next?
I'll take that question, because I think it's, to answer it first, if this bill were to be passed, it would be effective as of January 1, 2023. But the process for really seeing all of the positive impacts of this bill is really more of a long game, because the companies have a 10-year period before they'll have to come to the CPUC and seek a renewal. Some of those companies are already several years into their renewals process, and then so not until the companies actually have to come before the CPUC and seek a renewal will you see the impacts of the PUC being able to flex its regulatory authority. And then even in those instances, it's going to take some time perhaps for the companies to build out and comply with any requirements. But in the meantime, I think, especially with having an equal access to service requirement, I think you're going to see more entities become engaged on these issues, and building a stronger case for whenever it does come up for a renewal.
All right, thank you so much for all of the engaging questions. I believe that we can move forward.
Well, I just want to thank all of our speakers today for joining us. Thank you so much for informing us on what actually is broadband, what does it look like for where we live, and also what can we do next. And as many of us said, it's really important to have your voice heard. You can do that by submitting a letter of support, submitting some testimonies for its next step in the process. This bill will actually be heard in the Senate Senate Energy, Utilities, and Communications Committee. It's set for hearing on June 27th. So we highly encourage you to reach out to our office if you'd like to get more involved into what those next steps looks like. You can reach us. We have 3 different offices. If you go to our next slide, we can connect with you. My name's Catherine, and I'm based in the Pasadena office. We also have a Claremont office as well as our Capitol office. So highly encourage you to reach out to us. We hope that you found this town hall informative, but more importantly, hopeful. And we want to thank you on behalf of Assemblymember Chris Holden for being with us here today. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you.